Good day, everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jeff Payne. I'm the host of this webinar series, and I've been building, testing, securing, and delivering software now for 30 some odd years. I've run a couple of software consulting companies in the past couple of decades, including my current company, Coveros, that focuses on helping people accelerate their software delivery, integrating testing and security into that. We have a great topic today, supply chain attacks, and we have a great guest here today. I want to let him introduce himself. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself to the audience? Welcome to the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me. So my name is Jeff Williams. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Contrast Security. And like the other Jeff, I've had a long history in application security. I've been in software development. I started a consulting company where I worked with lots of very large enterprises building their AppSec programs. And I also helped to start OWASP. I was the first global chair at OWASP, and I contributed a bunch of different projects, including the OWASP Top 10. I'm super excited to be here to talk about supply chain attacks. I think this is a really interesting kind of new development in the AppSec market, so it'll be good to dive into it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Great to see you again. As always, we go way back. Jeff and I have been doing these kinds of things and talking AppSec for, I don't know, we're not even going to want to talk about how long.
Yeah, too long.
Long time. Yeah. So welcome. Thanks for being here. Really looking forward to this discussion today because this is such an important topic. So let's jump right into it. I want to get your thoughts and opinions. First to level set for the audience, talk a little bit about what a software supply chain is and how it might be different from other supply chains or the same as other supply chains that are out there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of it like a supply chain. Normal supply chain, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you're getting drugs and ingredients and compounds from other companies who get it from other companies who get it from other companies. And, you assemble your products based on this supply chain. Same thing for cars and iPhones and everything else. Well, software works kind of the same way. It's a complex supply chain where you get some code from lots of different places. You get open source code, you can get commercial libraries. They use other libraries. So, we've got a long supply chain, and then you write some custom code that integrates with all that stuff, and it all gets pulled together in, your compile process, your build process to form the final executable. But it's a complex process to pull all those pieces together.
Sounds like much like, a supply chain around an automobile manufacturing process, right? I mean, you've got suppliers, You've got, people who are integrating and assembling either more complex components or the entire car, right? At the assembly line, you're importing things, you're using other people's stuff. Some of it's runtime, right? Even now in our cars, there's lots of runtime stuff. So you mentioned kind of running runtime things. And then, of course, the whole process, right? You've got to move components around. You've got to ship them. You've got to store them. You need to make sure that they get to where they need to get to safely, securely. Sounds like very similar concept to, a more general supply chain that you would think of in industry.
Well, and the big problem is, even in the automobile industry, sometimes you get components that have flaws in them. Your seatbelts might break at highway speeds, or your gas tank might explode in an accident because it wasn't put in the right place, and so on. So, making sure that your supply chain has integrity and does the things that you expect it to do is really, really important. And so I kind of break it down into 4 pieces. When I think about the whole supply chain, I think it's easy to chunk it into these 4 pieces. First is the software you write. And that's easy piece to understand. That's been the focus of AppSec for the last 20 years, primarily is like, let's make sure the code we write is secure. Okay, that's important, but that's just one kind of software that ends up in your final application, right? The second is software you import. And, back in, like the early 2010s, we started talking about this at OWASP. We published some papers. We put it into the OWASP Top 10 in 2013 that you shouldn't use libraries that have known vulnerabilities, which seems like a really low bar to me, right? It basically means like, don't put a gas tank in that will explode on impact. But I mean, we're almost 10 years later now, and it's still a huge problem for companies just not using stuff that we know has vulnerabilities in it. And notice, unlike the auto industry, there's no like way to issue a recall. Like we don't have a notification infrastructure. So, there's some big components missing to our supply chain environment. So that was the first piece is what you write, what you import. The second is what you run. And there's a bunch of kinds of code that fit into this. It might be the JVM that you download and you run your applications on. It might be commercial libraries that you've downloaded that you're using. It's app servers and things like that. They're all in the application layer. They're not really imported. They're just bundled in with your application, and they make a huge difference for security. And then the last piece, and this is probably the most interesting and newest piece, is the software that you build with. This is the stuff that, your CI/CD pipelines, your compilers, your development tools. I mean, everything that's on your developer's laptop, and there's a god-awful amount of software on your developer's laptop, all that stuff is really in your supply chain because it's part of the software that's used to generate your applications. And, that's what we saw in SolarWinds. We can dig into that, as we go.
Yeah, great stuff. And I like the way you break it down into those different components. Now you kind of linearize them, but as you and I know, all of these issues have been around forever, right? Since we started doing computing, and papers were published in the 60s and 70s about all these different things. It's kind of interesting how, as an industry, maybe you call it mature, maybe I don't know what you call it, but how these things have kind of evolved and become the leading kind of challenge or issue, right?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's mature at all. Yeah. I think it's the exact opposite of mature. In fact, in order for us to focus on anything, we have to wait for it to blow up first. I mean, I literally published a paper called Java Enterprise Rootkits at Black Hat in 2009.
Great paper.
That talked about introducing backdoors into software applications through the CI/CD process. I said, hey, there's a bunch of ways you could do it. You could attack the CI/CD, you could put in a malicious test case, and that could infect the application, which would then flow downstream to, the consumers of that part of someone else's supply chain. And, I published the paper, I did demonstration live on stage. I think it's not a complicated concept, but almost no one in the industry did anything about it. I know of one company that has really sort of focused on making sure that their development tools and environment are secure. But most folks, really, it's kind of anything goes there. So that's not mature. That's waiting until it blows up and then, rushing in with fire extinguishers. Like, that's not a mature way to do things. We need to get in front of these risks.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I mean, we see that in our consulting practice. Unless we're hired specifically to address AppSec or DevSecOps issues, it's usually an afterthought for most organizations. We try to drag it in and pull it in because, of course, you can't build, test, and deliver, quality software without security. But it's interesting that it's not top of mind for many organizations, even though there's these huge issues out there that we see all the time that happen.
Well, nobody really took, like I said, we published all the library security stuff in, 2013 or something like that. And nobody really took it seriously until Equifax got breached with a struts vulnerability. Unfortunately, we wait until stuff blows up before we take it seriously. Like, you can look at any vulnerability. Jeremiah Grossman was talking about CSRF way before it started getting exploited and people took it seriously. And on and on. Like, unsafe deserialization is probably one of the most recent ones. Nobody cared. Great papers published at OWASP. And then, we wait until someone gets attacked.
Yeah, no. So let's dig into supply chain attacks themselves. And
can
you talk about the different components, how maybe it aligns with the various aspects of a supply chain that you talked about? You mentioned Equifax. Are there other good examples to give the audience an idea of these kinds of attacks and how they're orchestrated, executed, and then we'll talk about protection later.
Sure. So, I think the first thing to talk about is like attacks on your source code, like on that software you write category. And that's what OWASP is focused on for a long time. It's what the AppSec industry is focused on for a long time. That's kind of the traditional attacks, like, a direct SQL injection against your web application, and someone breaks in and steals your data. That's a typical attack. Uh, what we saw with Equifax was an interesting shift. Like the attackers, instead of focusing on the custom code and the application itself, they found expression language injection vulnerability in a version of struts that was widely used. So instead of having to attack each application individually, now they could just send one HTTP request to any application that was using that version of struts and completely take it over in one HTTP request. So they were able to cover lots of applications really fast. And so, that's great for the attackers. That's a force multiplier. They love that because it makes it easier for them to find targets. So that was like a nice evolution. And what we see is, like, as operating system security got harder, as it got harder to find kernel exploits, people moved to web apps, right? So now they're attacking the web apps. That was easy for a decade, really easy. But it maybe starts to get a little harder. And then people start moving to libraries. Like, oh, look, we can move to libraries and attack those. So now people are buckling down on library security, making sure their libraries are up to date and they're not using out of date, vulnerable versions. And now we're starting to see attacks on the build infrastructure. So things like, in SolarWinds, attackers attacked the CI/CD pipeline, broke in, and were able to insert a Trojan into the update that was being sent out to all their customers. So now, instead of having to go attack everyone themselves, now the attack is going out via a trusted channel, like SolarWinds update channel to all their customers. They're all getting these updates that have this malicious code in them. And sure enough, a bunch of them took the update and a bunch of them got hacked. So, it's attackers smartly adapting to changes in the ecosystem. It's not that those old attacks are going away. It's like they're adding on to the top with new classes of attacks.
Sounds like you just described maturity, though.
The attackers, they're more mature because they're just like, well, we'll adapt as things as we need to. Sure.
And that last one is an interesting one, because I know for us, we've always said that if you're going to talk DevSecOps, right, you're going to talk about, how do I address security through the life cycle and also not make it a hurdle to, deployment, that you need to consider the infrastructure that you're using to push code through. It's your vehicle. And everyone was like, la, 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 la. I don't want to hear that. That's silly. I don't know why you would do that. Why would you waste your time worrying about that? And here we are right now, just in the last 6 months, 12 months, you've heard a lot more. And really, the term supply chain attack's been around for a long time, but it seems like people have really latched onto it when the kind of the build infrastructure started getting attacked, right? So for whatever reason that is.
Well, we need to take building software more seriously. We're building a critical product, and, I think pharmaceutical companies take their build infrastructure really, really seriously, right? Mm-hmm. They've got integrity from, supplier all the way through the supply chain, all the way into production. They got, safety seals that go on the caps of drug bottles and so on. They've really taken steps to make sure that at every step of the supply chain, there's no way for attackers to compromise the integrity of their product. And we just don't have that in software. I mean, open source is a good example. We don't really know much about the provenance of open source. There could be any number of committers on a particular open source library. Many of those open source libraries don't have rigorous build processes. There's actually no integrity check between the source code and the delivered binary. So like your source code in GitHub, that could be one thing, but whoever builds it could make whatever changes they want, then build it, and then post that binary into a binary repo like Maven or something. And there'd be no way for most people to tell because we don't have that good integrity traceability between the source and the user of software.
Well, and a lot of people in the past have argued that open source, because so many eyes are on it, that it makes it more secure. I always laughed at that, right? And we've seen examples of security defects being in an open source app for a decade or more before someone before someone who wanted to fix it discovered it, right? So I mean, this idea that somehow open source is more inherently secure and I still hear people say that's a reason why you don't need to focus attention as much on it. And that's just not, in my opinion, true. What do you think about that?
The unfortunate reality is that we are relying on a very small number of volunteer security researchers who are brilliant and do fantastic work. But there's just a handful of them that are really doing testing on open source libraries and trying to find these vulnerabilities. And so, the overwhelming likelihood is that there's tons and tons of latent vulnerabilities in open source that nobody's ever discovered because nobody ever really looked very hard.
Right.
And that's just reality. We've got all these products that will search your code for known vulnerabilities. Well, guess what? Those are only the known vulnerabilities that we happen to know about.
Right. Yeah.
And it's all because of a very small number of researchers. So that's really unfortunate. It'll be for the amount of trust that we're putting in these products, we should be figuring out a way to get more assurance in them.
Yeah, no doubt. And as we know, software is eating the world, as Mark Andreessen said. Software is ending up in every product, every service, being connected like never before. And that just means this challenge is going to get harder and harder and more critical over time. We need solutions. So what are some ways that we can start to protect ourselves, whether we're the producer or the consumer? What do you see out there happening? What do you think is needed to put protections in place? If you're in the audience, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, you can go through each of these areas. Like for securing the software you write, I think we're pretty good at that. OWASP's got a lot of good materials on that. We've got decent tools in the market. I'm a big fan of interactive application security testing to make testing more accurate and faster and easier. So we kind of know what to do to eliminate vulnerabilities from your own code. I would recommend that you try to avoid piling up a big backlog of vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. Because it's such an anti-pattern. Every time we see a big backlog of vulnerabilities that are not getting fixed, we know the program's going the wrong direction. So that's for your own code. I think we know how to do that. I think we're doing much better at open source libraries. If you really want to tackle that, then there's things you can do. You can make sure that you're not using untrusted, open source libraries that have known vulnerabilities. There's a tool called Dependency Check from OWASP. There's also a number of commercial tools on the market, including Contrast, that will find those for you very easily and tell you what you need to do to fix them. It's not a complicated problem. It's certainly very doable and represents a big risk. So, I think those first two are really critical. Now, the third one, the software you run, I think is also not that challenging. This is, you want to make sure you stay on the latest versions of the software that you're using. So keep up to date with your JVM, your .NET versions, your app servers. It's part of using open source and these commercial components that you have to keep them up to date. So you're getting a big benefit from not having to write all that code yourself, but it comes with responsibility. And so with great power comes great responsibility. You've got to keep that code up to date. And then the last piece is this software you build with, right? And this is tricky because you've probably got a complex development environment with lots of different servers. You got test servers and build servers and development tools and notifications and integrations and plugins all over the place. So I encourage you to, get your hands around it. Probably the first step is to figure out what you're using and then focus on just, where are there risks there? Where think about threat modeling that environment. where could an attacker get in? Do you have good identity and access control to that environment? Are you protected against outside attacks? Do you have good configuration management? All those kinds of things will help you protect your development environment.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, your build environment is comprised of, software you may have written, or at least, some code around it, some open source,
Yep.
some software you're running that somebody else built. So it also has those same attributes of all those things. Plus, as you mentioned, the importance of making sure that the environments themselves and the access to, both these tools and also the environments is set up and structured to, limit the exposure, right? Limit the attack surface, try to make sure you're not, giving permissions or privilege to those who really don't need it. And, some of those age-old application security best practices, like, principle of least privilege and, all these things that we talk about in application security, we find it really applies to this build infrastructure just like it does everything else.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that you may run across as you start looking at this is the idea of building a software bill of materials. Mm-hmm. That's been a pretty important concept, I think, to get people to understand what software they're using.
Yeah, could you describe that for the audience, for those that don't know that term? They call it BOM, right? You'll see BOM as an acronym now. Can you describe that?
Yeah, in normal supply chains, you get a bill of materials with things that you order, and in software, you get a software bill of materials. It's basically just a list of all the software that's included in an application that you buy or use. And there are formats to generate an SBOM, so they can be machine readable and so on, and certain data that they include. But basically, it just lists off all the different components that are part of an application. And the idea is that if you know what's in there, then you can easily see like, oh, well, that's using an old version of what's this, and it's got a vulnerability in it, so I don't want to use that. So I think it's good for the market to have SBOMs. However, they're not a panacea. They don't actually fix anything. They're just visibility. And so, I think in terms of consumers, like being able to understand really what's in an SBOM, is going to be tricky. So, I think it's a good move in the right direction, and you should probably demand SBOMs from downstream suppliers. But, know that it's not everything. Like, you got to check the SBOM to make sure that there's not dangerous stuff in there.
Do you think right now people are putting too much weight behind an SBOM and giving it too much kind of authority and that you're going to get more out of it than you're describing? Do you think that's something that's happening out there? I mean, I hear it a lot now, right? And you didn't hear it 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
It just is a little weird to me. It's not the first thing I would ask for. If I was buying a car, I wouldn't ask for the list of parts. I would ask for like, hey, show me the safety test results.
Yeah.
Right?
Or,
like that would be a lot more compelling to me. Like, what did you test it for and how did it do? That would be really interesting. Who built it? Maybe a little bit about, like the provenance of the software, or like, I don't know. Were they trained in security? Like, did they follow a process? What tools did they use on it? Like, I might be interested in all those things before I demanded an SBOM to know like what, exact version of screw was used to bolt the engine onto the chassis. I don't know. Yeah. It's so like, I think it's a good step in the right direction, but I really think we need better visibility that would actually inform security decisions.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So we've been talking mostly about the producer side, right? Yeah. Talk a little bit about the consumer side of this. SBOM is one small piece of the solution. What can those who consume software do to protect themselves against software they're getting, right? It's coming to them. Well, what are the things out there, or where do you think that's headed?
It is tricky. And I feel, again, I'll use a car analogy. It's like, if I bought a car, I probably wouldn't be able to test it to know that it's safe or that it's in good shape or whatever. I'd have to take it to some expert mechanic to look at it. And that's unfortunate because most people don't have the staff in-house to do this on all the code that they're bringing in through their supply chain. It's just the volume is just insane. So it is tricky. And often you don't get source code along with these components that are coming in. It's only coming in as binary, so it makes it hard to check. One thing you can do is you can use IAST and test applications yourself. IAST attaches to the binary, instruments it, and watches it run, and then tells you if there's vulnerabilities. Now, of course, if you do discover a vulnerability, you're going to have to go back down the supply chain to put pressure on whoever gave you that to make sure that it's right, but at least you'll know.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that you can do that I think is interesting is you can use runtime application self-protection, or RASP, to prevent vulnerabilities from being exploited. So RASP works a little bit like IAST. It instruments the application, but it watches for attacks instead of vulnerabilities. And when it sees an attack, imagine it sees a SQL injection attack, it traces that all the way into the query, looks to verify, did that data modify the meaning of the query, which should never happen in any application ever. Mm-hmm. And if so, then it can prevent that query from going to the database. So it's definitely a compensating control for having vulnerabilities in your applications. So, and to me, it's a critical ingredient in any AppSec program is to have that protection at runtime, because most likely you've got vulnerabilities in production already somewhere. You just don't know it, and most likely you actually don't know who's attacking it. That's what RASP can give you, is that visibility.
Yeah, and there's other approaches that people take out there, right? Web application firewalls, SIM products. How do those differ in their approach or strategy with what you're describing with RASP? What are the different options out there, across the market from the consumer side?
All those other options try to identify attacks by looking at the traffic on the wire. And it's really difficult. Modern application traffic is complex. It's JSON documents, it's XML documents, it's serialized objects, and it's custom protocols that people dream up. And it's very difficult to just look at traffic on the network and say, I know that's an attack and this other one is not an attack. Because, attackers are really creative at encoding their attacks and, using complex syntaxes to try to bypass checks like that. So I think the right place to do this check is not on the wire at the perimeter, but within the application, where you have all the context of how that data is being used. And you can know that, hey, that attack is about to fire. Let's block it right there. It's a little bit like what happened in the IDS market, where companies like FireEye, the attacks got too complex to identify on the wire. So they started bringing them in and running them in detonating them in a sample environment, virtual environment. Right. It's a little bit like that. We can watch these attacks come in and prevent them from having their harmful consequences.
One last thing before we move on to the next topic, and that is prevention, right? So we've been talking mostly here about detection and then remediation. And you mentioned very early on, obviously, that we need to get better at prevention. What is the problem? Why is it that we refuse to do the things we need to do to at least try to build secure apps? We can never do that perfectly, but why don't we try? Or at least it doesn't appear that the market tries very hard.
Yeah, no, it's frustrating because I wrote the OWASP Top 10 in 2002, and here we are on the eve of 20 years later. And we're still seeing SQL injection pretty widespread, command injection, XSS, all the common paths.
Call it hygiene, right? This is hygiene. Yeah. This is like brushing your teeth. This is not hard, right, to do these things.
In some ways it's not, in some ways it is. In theory, those vulnerabilities are not tremendously complicated. But in modern software, they can be really complicated. Developers don't see the whole picture. They don't know everything that's going on in the framework and how the request gets to their code and which pieces of data are untrusted and which aren't. And so, they do their piece and they don't realize that they've introduced a vulnerability. And it's not their fault. It's really damn near impossible to figure out. So, one of the advantages of IAST is that it can get inside the application and track how it really works so that it can automatically identify these vulnerabilities. And ultimately, if we want to prevent developers from introducing these vulnerabilities in the first place, then we need to give them feedback really quickly, like while they're doing their normal work, so that they can see, oh, I see, when I do XYZ, I get pinged for a security vulnerability. Yeah. And when we get that feedback loop down to like a second, then developers can see, oh, wow, I see that's untrusted. I got to parameterize that, or I got to escape that, or whatever I got to do. And they learn, and then they can adopt patterns that will help them avoid those practices. But until we can do that, until you get that integrated into your pipeline and get the feedback going in a fast feedback loop, then you're kind of doomed. Because if it takes more than a week to get feedback to the developer, then forget it. And by the way, the average time to get a vulnerability fixed using static analysis is 4.5 months. So it's just way too long. You're not going to get any learning. There's no prevention there. You're probably the developer's probably gone. You're probably sending that bug to a different developer. So we've got to shorten those feedback loops. It's the only way out.
Yeah, and you mentioned piles of vulnerabilities. We see that a lot. I mean, one of the services that people leverage Coveros for that's very tactical is, hey, I've been running all these tools and I have all these vulnerabilities. Maybe they're vulnerabilities I don't even know.
Right.
And you triage, sort through them, prioritize them, figure out which ones I should care about, and then help us fix them, because they're just not doing it and they just pile up, and that's very risky, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I know lots of organizations that have 20, 50, 100,000 vulnerabilities in some, vulnerability tracking system, or risk register, or bug tracking system, or God forbid, an Excel spreadsheet. I've seen everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy. So last topic, I want to ask you about the executive order. So back in May, President Biden signed an executive order around cybersecurity, recommending and asking for certain things to occur to help make things better from a cybersecurity perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that executive order? And what do you think about it in terms of, is it going to make a difference? Are we going to be able to operationalize anything in there? Do you think anything in there is helpful? And what do you think about the whole process that's being followed to try to operationalize this concept?
So I was really excited about this EO when it came out. It's really, it had a direct focus on application security. It was spurred on by attacks like SolarWinds and Equifax and, some of the ransomware stuff. And, I think it had a bunch of really good basic ideas in it that said, hey, we should define what critical software is. We should say, how do you identify attacks and respond to them? How do you focus on security quality in the development process? How do you do testing and so on? Lots of really good stuff. And then they delegated to NIST to go, build standards and guidelines around this thing. And so NIST, the first thing NIST did was to hold a workshop, which was cool. I was asked to participate, and I gave a talk about how I think about security testing and how we get good at, testing the really important stuff and not the other things. And a bunch of other people presented at this, and then NIST went off. The first thing they came out with was a definition of critical software. And I have some real heartburn with this. I wrote about it on LinkedIn, but their definition of critical software doesn't match up to, I suspect, what you and I would think of as critical software. Like, I was thinking like power plants and industrial factories and election systems and, military systems, maybe like critical systems.
Critical infrastructure,
That's what I'm thinking, right?
systems, safety-oriented things.
Yeah, things where you could lose lives, where you could cause massive financial damage, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And healthcare. That's not what they defined critical software as. They said basically any software module that runs with privilege, which really boils down to like security tools, right? Because so that's weird. It's like
that doesn't meet any definition of like criticality or assessment of criticality or risk that you would use,
it's
right?
Very strange to me, right? It's not contextual, right? And context matters here. I don't care what you run with privilege on your home desktop machine. I don't care what we run with privilege in most offices. Like, I care about stuff that controls critical things, and most of those things don't run with privilege. They're privileged by nature. Like, what they do is 100% privilege. They control the power grid. And so it's just like, I think of like the Venn diagram here, and it's like very little overlap between the definition and what it ought to be. So I'm super frustrated with that. And they just put it out. They didn't ask for comment or anything. They just put it out, bam. So we're stuck with it. Now, just over this last weekend, they put out the next document, which is about guidelines for minimum security testing. Okay, I thought, great. It's probably in there. It ought to say, hey, you should define what really matters for whatever critical system we're talking about, and then test that the right security defenses are in place, that those defenses are correct and effective, and that they're used in all the right places.
Something like that?
I'm sorry, say it again?
You mean threat modeling or something like that?
Well, yeah, kind of like it should be a threat model. And then from the threat model, you should be able to say, hey, here's the places we need defenses, and your testing should test those defenses because those are what matter. But that is not what they did. The document they put out says you should run a bunch of different kinds of tools. So it says like you got to do some static stuff, and you got to do some dynamic stuff, and maybe you want to do some fuzzing. And I mean, for me, it's not a minimum standard for
That's
testing.
A minimum standard.
It's just a tool soup. It just says run some tools. You're not going to get anything out of that. It doesn't say, do you have to fix everything that the tools report? It doesn't say how you tell the difference between something that's important that a tool reports and something that's not important or false that a tool reports. It's really frustrating. So, I wish, I don't know what to say about it. I mean, I think like, given the first few steps at implementing the EO, I think they're way off, and I don't think it's going to help anything. I think it's going to get largely ignored, which is unfortunate. We had a chance here, a real chance to make a generational difference in application security. And I challenged them at their workshop to do just that. And they seem to just be, kind of taking the very easy way out here, just listing a little bit of conventional wisdom, which hasn't been working since 20 years, and it hasn't worked yet. I don't see how the EO is going to change that, or at least the NIST standards implementing the EO are going to change that. We got to do something a little bold. They could have said, hey, you need to produce a document that shows that all the critical threats to your system have been addressed, and that those security defenses have been thoroughly tested. And I don't care how you test them, actually. Do pen testing on them, do static analysis, do IAST, do, whatever. As long as you test it, it doesn't matter. But instead they said, no, you got to run all the different tools on everything. It's like saying, hey, we got a nail to hammer in. So you got to hammer it in with the wrench and the drill and the hammer and the screwdriver. Like,
just to be sure.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like they somehow think that's defense in depth, which it's not as described there. That's not it. That's not it. It's not the way you get defense in depth.
No.
Not that you don't want to use different types of analysis to look for and identify and hopefully correct different types of issues, but You can't just like machine gun it. I mean, you know, right? I mean, application security to some extent came out of quality because
Sure.
of defects, right? And we all know in quality you can't test everything, and so you have to
That's right.
apply a risk based, right, a definition of criticality or importance or whatever, and you have to be more like a surgeon. In quality, you if you don't do that in security, you're not going to get any better results because they're the same issue, right? It's just, you know, the cause or consequence of the defect or the flaw, right?
Yeah, my big push, I'm glad you brought up that quality thing, because my big push over the last few years has been to break down application security silos and to try to get the development teams doing their own application security work. Really, nothing else works. Like if you keep it as a silo, you almost instantly become a bottleneck in every organization because there's too much code, too much work. So you end up lowering your standards and not triaging anything, and you end up with this, giant backlog and all that. What we have to do is give that instant feedback, use the big machinery of software development to do that work of remediating vulnerabilities. Uh, that's really the only way that I can imagine a software factory working effectively and producing secure product.
Yeah, I mean, someone called that DevSecOps, right? You know, the goal
Yeah,
being to break apart this very, you know, monolithic silo of security and get it pushed into or toward development, shifting left, and
yeah.
getting it back into the. And I don't know if you think that the DevSecOps movement has helped, or is it just another term people are using? Has it made an impact, right? In your
Yeah,
opinion?
I think it has. I mean, I think it got people talking about shifting left. But the problem is, I don't think most people appreciate how fundamental a change like waterfall to DevOps is. Like it's not just about shifting left, right?
Yeah.
In development, like, and it's the same change that security has to go through. We have to fundamentally change the nature of the work and break it up into small pieces, create tight feedback loops, get that work flowing into production, and focus on a culture of experimentation and learning. It's the same stuff that organizations have gone through on the development side to transform how they build the software itself.
Great stuff, Jeff. So,
Hey, I'll say this about shifting left. Be really careful that you're not just taking existing security tools and making the developers run them, because those are tools for security people. They're not tools for developers. So you end up what I call shitting left. You're just pushing work down on a development team that's not good for them.
can we quote you on that?
Absolutely.
Everybody tweet that out, associated with Jeff and
Yep.
this webinar. Yeah, but that's a great point. So thanks for your thoughts on that. This has been a great discussion. We have more here, so please no one go away. We do want to do a quick poll of the audience and see what you think about a couple of things. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexa to you know, pop open a poll and let people vote. The first one is, how concerned is your organization about supply chain attacks, software supply chain attacks? Now, this is kind of a 1 to 5, but it's kind of from a what to, you know, it's a high priority. So please take a minute and vote here, and then we'll look at, you know, what the results are. Okay, well, I don't know if that's what you expected to see, Jeff, or not. I guess we the first one, I guess we covered that in this webinar, so no one thinks now they don't know what a supply chain is, right? But I've heard a rumor we care seems to be the winner right now. Does that shock you or surprise you? I'm guessing not, based on your comment.
I think you know, well, it's probably pretty accurate. Like most folks, it's probably rumor level. Like, wow, it sounds like somebody should do something about that. But
Yeah.
it doesn't really. It's not. I suspect it's not really anyone's direct job in most organizations, and so I don't know if organizations have a great way of thinking about this for software yet.
Well, I mean, and that's a great point, because if you think about it, you know, the people who are the ones that build, versus the people that run, or you leverage what runs versus the people that build the infrastructure around your delivery process. We'd like them all to be integrated and cross-functional and working together in a DevOps model, but we know a lot of times they're not yet. It would seem like it would make that difficult to pull off, right, end to end, because you've got a lot of touch points there as currently constructed in organizations.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next poll, Alexa. We at least attempt to secure our apps. Not surprising, right? That gets back to OWASP and some of the stuff that's been around for decades. It looks like some people have made some progress on protecting their build process and
that's great.
Open source, which is great. That's what we need more of. Nobody's claiming they've got it fully integrated. And everybody's learned what a supply chain is today. So, does that surprise you? I kind of expected this to look like the last one, but it structurally looks a little different.
Yeah, I'm glad to see some people are doing some things to protect. Well, I don't know if they were answering the build process or the open source piece. I wouldn't be surprised if half the people are protecting open source, but I would be surprised if half the people were protecting their build process.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thanks, Alexa. So some learning opportunities that are related to what we're talking about here, I do want to mention before we get to questions. First, we've got a couple of live virtual classes coming up that you might find interesting if you're interested in these subjects. And if not you, definitely refer others. We have our security testing for test professionals class coming up next in early August. This is a class specifically for those involved in the testing process that want to learn how to start integrating some security testing into their day-to-day testing lives. And this is a very popular course. If you're in the testing community, it's a great way to start to get yourself up to speed on security. We also have an implementing DevSecOps class coming up in late August, where we will talk about all things associated with, as we talk, shifting left, getting people engaged and involved throughout the process, leveraging tools at the appropriate places, talking threat modeling and other things to help you, be strategic about what you're doing. That class is coming up as well. Happy to announce, if you haven't heard, that the Star West and Agile DevOps East conferences that are being held this fall are going to be done in person. So we are so excited to see people again in person. And hopefully people can make it. We're offering anyone who registered for this webinar a 20% discount for either of those conferences. So if you're interested, there's a discount code here that you can use to get savings off of those. And we'd love to see you in either Anaheim or Orlando. For those of you that aren't aware of the Hub, so the Techwell Hub is an online Slack community of software professionals. We have over 7,000 members at this point. It is free. You can go to hub.techwell.com to register. There is a security channel. It's #security. I'm going to head over there after this webinar ends. And if there are any other additional questions we didn't get a chance to answer today, we can certainly carry on the conversation at the Techwell Hub. I do want to announce our next webinar, which is coming up in October. It's called Everything You Need to Know About Containers, But We're Afraid to Ask. We're going to cover all things containers, from what are they, to how do you leverage and use them, to how do you how do you orchestrate containers, how do you integrate security into what you're doing with containers, how do you test software in containers, how do you test the containers, all that fun stuff. And Rich Mills is going to join me. He's been doing CI/CD and containerization for a long time and understands these issues really well. We're going to have a great conversation. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to answer some questions that you have. Anybody, Alexa, you want to start firing off some questions we've been receiving?
Yes, our first question, safety seals were a result of people putting poison in over-the-counter medicine, i.e. something really bad. But what kind of thing will need to happen to take application security serious given the bad things that have happened?
Cool. What else can we do, Jeff? Short of blowing up the world, is there anything we can do to get people to care?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I mean, certainly there could be some attack on a critical system that causes lots of death. We could tank the economy. I used to work on applications for some major international financial organizations. And, if one of their applications got compromised, it could crash the economy. And, maybe that would be enough. I don't know. It seems like, like after Equifax, Congress did hearings, and then they issued a statement condemning the attacks. And I think it's like most people have the wrong model for AppSec. Like they're outraged when there's a vulnerability, and then it gets fixed, and they're like, okay, well then we're back to safe.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't realize that, every company has tons of vulnerabilities out there. I mean, the average application has like 30 vulnerabilities in it. So I don't know. I think people's model of it is wrong. It's like they assume things are safe until they hear different, and they shouldn't. They should actually, like if you're a security person, you think everything is insecure unless someone provides some proof. So it's just, I don't know how you change it. It might be partly human nature.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I zeroed right in on the fact that the example was one that was safety related and people died. I mean,
Yeah.
you hate to be morbid about it, but it almost takes that big of an
Yeah.
issue. It can't just
We're
be
getting
your
close,
data, people got your data, or they stole your identity, or, this thing doesn't work. And, that stuff's all fine, but it doesn't stick. It's got to be.
Yeah. If it's like healthcare related, a broad attack on healthcare systems, that might do it. If it was, certainly pacemakers has that risk threat kind of, but it could also be like an attack on a fuel pipeline or an energy system that causes people to not have air conditioning for days during a drought. You're going to kill a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good question.
Okay, next question. Why isn't there more talk of air gapping networks?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it seems like you ought to be able to just separate some computers in a separate network and run them that way. But the problem is, once you start separating computers, they lose a lot of their value. So, even the systems that like run an industrial factory, you'd think those could be separated, but actually, people need to check on those from, their mobile phone, or like they need to, access to do things. And they need alerts, they need updates, all of which, have to come in over the internet. And pretty soon, even if they're not officially connected, someone's going to create an unofficial connection and create that connectivity. It's just really hard these days to prevent networks from getting connected, because that's what they're designed to do. They naturally connect to each other.
Well, and as we move toward Internet of Things, and everything's going to get connected together.
Yeah.
Right. And we're going to want it because it gives us convenience. And this gets back to the, usability versus security, or functionality versus security trade-offs that we're always going to have.
I think we lost this air gapping fight back in like 1995 somewhere.
It's over.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that is a strategy, right? If it can work for your system or application, but for most, to your point, it's not what we want.
Okay, next question. I think you started responding to this in chat, but maybe you could elaborate some more. The question is, our team has been talking about where to start, but there's so much. What places should we focus on first?
Yeah, Jeff, you want to go first?
No, go ahead. Sounds like you already started, so keep rolling.
Well, like the way I think about it, I think about a DevSecOps transformation, and it's going to take a big company several years to transform from a DevOps organization to a real DevSecOps organization. But if you're starting as like a traditional waterfall organization, then you've got to do both. And Like I don't think you should think about there's like one recipe for getting there. I think there's a lot of different paths you can take. Some companies are technology driven, so you should probably start with tools. Some companies are very process driven, so you should think about updating your processes. Other ones are culture driven, and you might think about training or executive sponsorship. But I don't think it matters a lot the exact steps you take if you have the goal in mind. And ultimately, you want to get to a place where you've got all of your applications identified, where you're testing them all automatically and continuously. So you're getting continuous security feedback on all your applications. And then you're managing with metrics. You're looking at the most critical threats, you're systematically eliminating those vulnerabilities and beefing up your defenses. Ultimately, you want to get to this place I call the new normal. It's when you have confidence that all your stuff is secure and you do testing so that if any application all of a sudden comes out of compliance, like introduces a vulnerability or is not following your practices, you know about it quickly and you can fix it and be right back to compliant. You might think like continuous assurance kind of approach. That's where you're trying to get. And like there's a lot of pathways there. Larry Maccheroni does some great talks about this. He led the DevSecOps transformation program at Comcast, and you can learn a lot looking at his talks. He introduced a few practices at a time, and his program is really built on trust between developers and between security folks and developers. I think every once in a while I hear somebody say something like, well, we need to crack down on the developers, and if they make security mistakes, 3 strikes and they're out. I got an argument on LinkedIn with a guy about this recently, and it's that I think that is exactly the wrong instinct. You absolutely want to try to veer towards trust and support, coaching and toolsmithing, rather than compliance and enforcement.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and you touched on it when you talked process versus tools versus culture, people, training and education. Yeah. I mean, they're all pieces of the moving part. I would just emphasize you need a plan of attack, right? I mean, you need to think this through and figure out, where are the areas that I need to improve upon, and which one do I think in the short term is going to help me? I love obviously an iterative approach like you described that Larry is a fan of. We are as well. But if you don't have a plan, right, you're just going to flounder around. You're going to try tools. You're going to try processy stuff. You're going to try some culture, maybe some training. We see this all the time. People come to us and they want something. I want a training class, or I want a coach, or I want something. Can you put this tool in place? And we always say, well, what are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
Because maybe that does make sense to do first or next or whatever. But if you haven't thought it through enough to have a plan of attack and a justification behind what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, you're probably just going to flail. And then it's not going to be 2 years, right, to get through a transformation. It's going to be infinity. We know organizations, they've been transforming for a decade and they're still not that far away from where they started because they just won't step back and think it through and then stick to plan. You can iterate your plan, right? In Agile DevOps, but you have to have a direction, right?
I'll say one thing and I've done a lot of these AppSec program implementations over the years. And one dimension of it that a lot of people don't think about is how are we going to prove value at the end of the year?
Yeah.
Because,
the ROI.
AppSec budgets are all over the place. And if you want to build a program, you need to come up with a plan for year one. And by the end of year one, you better have proved some value. You need to have, improved security, reduced risk, eliminated vulnerabilities, trained a lot of people. You have to have some numbers and statistics to show that you're improving. And the best statistics are things like, hey, we reduced the mean time to remediate, we increased the development pipeline velocity, things that the business cares about. More than just like the security metrics. So if focus on generating those metrics, and your program will probably continue to grow over the years.
Yeah, and to your point, you have to set the right expectation on how long this is going to take. right? A lot of times people will go into this with the wrong expectation on time, and then they get frustrated when in 3 months, you can't show some tremendous, return. Well,
Right.
change just doesn't work that way.
One recent supply chain white paper has suggested that people build their own dependencies from source rather than using binaries. What do you see in practice, and what is your recommendation?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting, and I hinted at this earlier. Open source developers write code, they commit it to a source code repo, and that's great. Everybody can look at it and read it. But then there's another thing called a binary repo where developers store the actual binaries for their libraries. So like you might use GitHub as your source code repo, and you're probably using Maven or PyPy or RubyGems or something as your binary repo. And they don't have to match. And so this paper is obviously suggesting like, well, you can avoid that problem if you just clone the GitHub repo and build it yourself, build your own binaries. And that would give you a little better argument towards the integrity of that piece of the pipeline. But it's a lot of work. I did a paper at an AppSec USA conference a few years ago where I did exactly this on 5,000 open source libraries. And then I created a tool to compare the binary that I generated versus the matching binary in the binary repos. And 11% of them didn't match, which was a shockingly big number to me. I thought, I'd be much closer to, like 1 or 2% didn't match. But it all just looked, and I went through a lot of the diffs, and they didn't look like attacks. They just looked like, bad process. So that, their source and binaries aren't in sync. Frankly, I think, while you might avoid some really bad attacks this way, it's a pretty narrow threat, and you're probably better off focusing on, just standard AppSec stuff. Like make sure your code doesn't have SQL injection. That's the way you're going to really protect yourself.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today. This was great, awesome, and for everybody out there, thanks for attending as well. And hope to see you at a future conference, webinar, or training event. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the time today. You can connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to continue any of these conversations that way as well.
Awesome.